Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Altmetrics for books. Thanks very much for joining us. We've got a great session lined up, so I hope you enjoy it. I've just got a few intro slides before we get into our main guest speakers, but please let me know throughout if you're having issues hearing or seeing anything. So welcome to the webinar. We will be recording it and the slides will be made available afterwards. If you have any questions, just drop them in the question box that you see in the GoToWebinar panel. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. And do let us know if you can't hear or see. We'll do what we can to fix that while we go along. Could one of our panelists just let me know if you can see my screen? If you could just unmute yourselves and tell me.
Yes, that's fine.
Lovely, thank you. So today's agenda, as I mentioned, I'll give a quick introduction to Altmetrics for books and the work that we've been doing here. We'll then hear from our guest speakers, and they've got some great slides lined up. I've had a quick click through, so looking forward to them. And then at the end, we'll leave some time for questions. So if you do have any, please send them in throughout the presentations, and we'll get to them at the end. And these are our speakers. So joining us today, we have Amy Earhart. Amy is an associate professor at Texas A&M University. She specialises in digital humanities and is based in the Department of English. We also have Jane Winters from the School of Advanced Study. Jane is a professor of digital humanities, and I've seen her present before, so I know she has an awful lot to say about Altmetrics for books. There's a lot of great stuff. And then we have Charles Watkinson. Charles is director of University of Michigan Press and an associate university librarian for publishing at Michigan. So why are we here to talk about Altmetrics for books? Well, amongst the many, many reasons is really the increasing pressures and challenges that arts and humanities researchers are facing. So their tenure committees, their institutions, their funders are asking them to publish monographs and to provide evidence of the value and the broader reach of those publications. So really, we're going to be talking about where Altmetrics can help them achieve that. For the publishers, commissioning editors are generally looking to produce more books and to make sure that those books are of good quality and of high interest to the audiences that they're trying to target. And then increasingly, global assessment programs such as the REF or the ERA in Australia are putting more and more value on publications such as books. So they don't just want to see journal articles, they want to see research outputs from all disciplines and the ones that make the most sense for the research that you're doing. And traditional metrics really don't help with regards to books in this matter. You know, you can look at the number of downloads or the number of page views or the number of sales, but they don't give you much information about why a book is popular or what people really thought of it. And this is where Altmetrics come in. So they provide real-time insights into the online dissemination and discussion relating to scholarly books. At Altmetric, we've had quite a bit of experience already with developing Altmetrics for books. In April 2015, we launched Bookmetrics. Bookmetrics was a project that we built in conjunction or in partnership with Springer Nature to showcase the online attention and dissemination and engagement surrounding their books. There were two parts to the project. One was this image that you see on the left-hand side of my slide, and this is the public-facing details page. So when you're on a Springer Nature book on the Springer Link platform, you can click through on the mentions numbers to reach this page, and it will give you a full overview of all of the online attention, the shares, the discussion, the readers that an individual book or chapter has seen. And then in the middle of the slide here, you see the back end of the platform. So this is what the staff within Springer Nature see. And it really helps them get a good picture of the online activity that's happening around their whole portfolio. And then in spring 2016, we built on this work. So we've now extended it so that more publishers can get this kind of insight for their books. And I'm sure Charles will cover a little bit of this later in his slides. So what Badges for Books enables publishers to do is to add our Altmetric badge, so the donut visualization, to their book pages to help their authors and their editors and other interested stakeholders see the online attention surrounding those books. And really importantly, this isn't just at the book title level. We can actually dig down into each chapter to show you which chapters have received the most attention, which items specifically within the book are being commented on, and it helps editors and authors really understand which content was most appealing to certain audiences or which perhaps sparked some controversy or drove further discussion. And in terms of what the data tells us so far, we're talking quite high volumes here. It's not small amounts of discussion online. So to date, Altmetric have tracked mentions of over 550,000 books across 15 different sources of attention. So those include mentions in the mainstream media, references from policy documents, and also comments from post-publication peer review forums. So a mixture of social, general, public, and academic attention. And you can see in the graph how the volume of this has grown. Obviously, we started our tracking last year, and we do have some historical data, but the coverage isn't quite as good. But certainly now there is some real volume to these mentions, and there's a lot of engagement taking place around this content online. So I'll stop there. That was just a little intro to what we do, and I will hand over to Amy, who I'm just going to make a presenter now. If I can find the go to webinar panel. Here we go. So as I mentioned, Amy is based at Texas A&M, and I'm sure she will give us a great intro to the work that she's been doing in this area.
All right. Yes? Are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, excellent. So hello to everyone. Thanks for listening to our webinar. I decided to take a little step back and sort of talk about where faculty, as the faculty representative, I wanted to kind of talk about where faculty are with metrics and then move into why altmetrics are so helpful. Because I think when we think about the challenges with metrics and sort of where the faculty fears are, it may help us to understand how altmetrics are useful and even how sort of traditional metrics are useful. So that's where I'm going to start with my brief presentation. Let's just start with the idea that faculty are nervous about metrics, at least in the U.S., which is my perspective, but from what I've understood from other international colleagues, this is the case. In the United States, we've had the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, release a statement on academic analytics, which is a company that does large-scale analysis of a number of factors, but citations are one of them. And they have stated that these research metrics are not particularly useful, but the problem is many universities have purchased this package and are using it to make decisions about impact, about funding, and many other things. I come out of a humanities background. I'm in the Department of English. I work in digital humanities and race studies. And because of the position of these fields, they're not within the traditional literature fields, we have always been particularly attentive to how various measures of metrics and impact have bias, because if you're not a traditional field, you're always a little nervous about how you're represented. And certainly metrics are problematic in many ways for humanities people, because we often view them as having a science bias. We're particularly not comfortable with quantifying quality of our research, and metrics are seen as a way to box us into a particular corner with our research. So for all of these reasons, we need to start thinking about metrics, I think, in a new way. And the first way to think about metrics and altmetrics is that context matters. And by that I mean, what do we know about our national outlook on academia? This makes a difference. So in my particular context, when we think about impact, American institutions have a particular take on our purpose within our society, and that makes a difference in how we understand impact factors. Our institutional profiles are also quite important. I teach at a public institution. We have certain goals that are set for our state and our nation because we are partially taxpayer funded. The same goes for the type of institution we are. We're considered an R1, a Research 1 institution. We have different goals than perhaps a teaching institution might have. And finally, discipline matters. And here I want to just sort of push a little harder on the idea of citation indexes and why altmetrics are so crucial. Our institution purchased an academic analytics package, and as you know, every institution may have a bit different package, have a different sort of package depending on what they purchase. When they run the numbers for our institutional departments, what they do is use an academic analytics package that uses an analysis of journal articles from 2010 to 2015 and books from 2005 to 2014. It's important to know this because this reveals, when we talk about discipline matters, this reveals in disciplinary bias in the way we might understand citations and impact factors. For those of us in the humanities, a mark of impact is actually longevity. So you can see foundational materials in our fields being cited for 20, 30, even 40 years. But if you cut off an impact factor, if you start deciding that only the past 5 years of journal articles matter, you actually miss a good chunk of disciplinary context. Now that wouldn't be the same as sciences. Certain science fields, if the article is over 3 years old, it is not important anymore. So again, we need to understand the context for our metrics, and this is why we need to look at both traditional metrics but also think forward into altmetrics. As a humanist, we also know that humanities citations are vastly inaccurate for lots of reasons, but here are a few. Citations are only scraped for digital forms. So if you're a book-based form that hasn't been digitized, like the University of Michigan Press, which I work with, has been really good about having open access digital versions, they get scraped pretty well by citation indexes. But if you have a print book that's never been digitized, it is unlikely that it will be scraped for citations. Essay collections are also less likely to be indexed, and this is a huge problem. Certain journals and presses aren't indexed. This is particularly true of new fields like the digital humanities. A lot of the sort of big name digital humanities journals haven't yet been brought into indexes. And we know that article-based disciplines have a higher citation index use than book-based disciplines. So again, another reason to think more broadly. And of course, with altmetrics, the one thing that traditional citation metrics ignore are other markers of impact like Twitter and blogs, which are huge factors of impact in my field. Just to give you a brief example from my personal experience of this, here are two different impact factors of citation indexes of one of my articles that was published. This is from a larger collection called The Debates in Digital Humanities, the first version. And what I found was, as I sort of looked through the various citation indices, the Web of Science thinks I have 4 citations. Google Scholar thinks I have 19, and I have been pretty diligent about collecting citations, and I have about 60. So that's quite a difference in terms of impact and reputation, and you can imagine when you run a departmental impact factor and you use only the Web of Science, that's a very different and unrealistic, inaccurate representation of the work we're doing. So enough of the problems with it. What can we do? What might we do to fix these issues? And we've talked a lot in our institution and particularly our department about how to take back our metrics. And by that I mean think about positive uses of metrics. And I want to highlight these 4 items because I think we've had a good track record of rethinking the way metrics might work for us in our department. First, I think it's really crucial to educate faculty. We often do not understand metrics. We don't understand even what the difference between metrics and altmetrics might be. Here's where you can have a library faculty coalition within the institution. When we went through our annual our external review, which happens every 5 years or so, we went to our library folks in scholarly communication, and they came over and we asked them for help, and they came over to our department and did a workshop with our faculty and talked about how to collect metrics and how to represent ourselves with our metrics. I've included this link by Bruce Herbert, who's Director of Scholarly Communications at our institution. It's open access, so you can get to it. Best practices for the use of scholarly impact metrics. This is a pretty helpful little handout that we gave to our faculty members to get them to think about collecting metrics. And what was really great about this workshop is people came in very skeptical of metrics and thinking that this wasn't useful, and by the end of our workshop, faculty were convinced that collecting these metrics might be a good idea and might actually be really useful to not just prove our value, but also to understand where our scholarly materials are being read and used. The other thing I'd like to have us think about a little bit is to ask journals to index, to make sure journals and publishers are getting their work out there. I spoke to the editor of Digital Humanities Quarterly at MLA this winter, and they are working on entering the Web of Science, which is really wonderful since that's the one that a lot of the big metric systems pick up. I know over the years that some of the materials I've published in scholarly editing hadn't been indexed, and I asked them to go through and have them indexed, and they did. So faculty can have a lot of impact just by asking and highlighting to publishers and journals why we need our work to be indexed. We also have talked a lot about, at our institution, creating an individual narrative using metrics. In other words, instead of just using them for the institutional view, what might you learn from the metrics? And I think this is really crucial, and here's where Altmetrics, I think, is foundational. In my field, social media is crucial to understanding my work. So I know that if something is tweeted at a conference about a particular chapter I wrote or a book that I wrote, and it gets retweeted, that shows me something about how my work is being understood. If someone writes a blog, that tells me something important. So we need to have a measure of that, and that's where Altmetrics are really useful. The other thing that I can tell you from looking at metrics is that open access increases use, especially outside of the U.S. for our materials. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And what this allows us to do is when you look at your metrics, this is a thing that was so crucial to the faculty in my department, it allows us to think about targeting our publications. And so traditionally we think of certain publishers and journals as having high impact, but what we found when we actually looked at the metrics is there are certain traditional high impact journals that are certainly there, but we found other types of work that we sent our work to, we sent our materials to, actually had a higher readership than what we might think of as high impact journals. So that tells us something really crucial. All right, and along with that, I think you use a variety of tools to build that narrative. So the University of Michigan Press has put the Altmetrics tools onto their open access materials, and you can look up and see what blogs, who's talking about your work on blogs, who's talking about your work on Twitter. This is really crucial, especially because, as you see over here, this is the same book that's being highlighted. Here's the American Lit Scholar in the Digital Age is being highlighted on Google Scholar. Here it is with Altmetrics, but what you can see is that Google Scholar is actually fairly inaccurate because these two items are chapters within the book, but not being picked up as the overall metrics. So we need these alternative metrics to build our narrative. And of course, we can't discount old-fashioned research, library resources, and web crawls. The other thing I want to end with is that as we're looking at these multiple tools, faculty need to figure out how to pull all these materials together and to use our existing measurements, whether they're Altmetrics or traditional measurements, to emphasize our priorities. So one of the really great things we did in our department during our annual review was to look at academic analytics, and beyond supplementing with Altmetrics, we went through and we said, what are 4 different goals of our department? We knew that some of our goals were interdisciplinary work, or having our work be cited by leaders in the field, or citations of our work being understood by scholars outside of English studies or even outside of the U.S., that we are international in looking out of the U.S. So we were able to use our traditional analytics to prove this, that we could ask every individual faculty member to look for a citation of your work by a leader in the field. And this was a very helpful way to think about metrics. So I really want to end there and turn over to my other use metrics. How do we understand? How might we move forward with our metrics questions to faculty members.
Thanks, Amy. That was really great. I think it's particularly interesting for everyone to hear about like your real world examples. It's always fascinating to me to hear what's actually going on within an institution. I'm going to hand over now to Jane. So Jane, I'm just going to make you the presenter, and don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay, right. Well, I hope everybody can see the screen now. Let me just get rid of that. I'm going to agree with so much that Amy has just talked about, and I think I'm going to take a step even further back than she did and look fundamentally at why humanities researchers publish and how that's all tied up with measurements of value and how things were evaluated and how we can inform that process. So thinking through, there's a mixture of reasons. Some of them are more altruistic than others. The first thing is to get your research known. Nobody does research because they want to hide it from people. You want to get out there and have people know what you're doing. And really crucial to the publication process as well is that it's a mechanism for soliciting feedback from your peers. And that's both peer reviewers and readers at various stages through the lifetime of your publication, whether it's pre-publication or post. And generally, we publish our research to contribute to debate in our subjects and to advance knowledge. But then at the bottom of my list, there's the one that actually is probably at the forefront of most people's minds more of the time, which is to develop your career and to get that first job and keep that job and make sure that you can carry on doing the thing that you love doing. So there are many different forms of publication. I'm sure I don't have to tell you. Journal articles where so much attention has been paid around evaluation and metrics and altmetrics and open access in a way that simply hasn't happened yet for books. Edited collections, that's already been picked up by Amy as something that's not particularly well indexed or picked up by current measures of evaluation. And then there's a whole range of other different types of writing and publishing that humanities scholars are particularly well placed to do because our subjects are very often of wide public interest, and those are frequently linked to impact and public engagement. But then, of course, the key one still for most humanities disciplines is the monograph, the book. That's what's valued when it comes to the tenure process, to getting your first job. And it's also, much of our research still needs to be produced in that long form that allows for the real in-depth analysis that a journal article simply can't provide. So then there's a tricky question of where to publish, and this, I think, is where a lot of concerns kick in about evaluation and measurement, particularly for people at an early stage in their career. For example, there's this nagging sense that there's this hierarchy of publishers that everyone else knows about, and you just haven't cracked that particular secret yet. And do the assessment mechanisms that exist in various national contexts value particular publishers and book series above others? I know in the UK, certainly, it's not just university presses that are thought to have this extra value, but particular university presses. So there are hierarchies within hierarchies, or at least there are perceived to be. And then coming on to open access publication, which is in many ways quite fundamental to altmetrics. There's a perception that that's a real risk, that it's somehow new and different and is going to cause problems and affect the way people value and see your research. And finally, there's an odd quandary around being encouraged to have impact and get your research out there and read, but at the same time, this sense that a trade book, which might reach exactly that wider audience, is not going to be valued within current systems of reward because it doesn't have quite the same scholarly cachet as a monograph that's published with a university press. So there are all these questions about value swirling around. And central to all of them is peer review. It underpins our understandings of quality, and it's inextricably linked to reputation and to career progression. And there are all sorts of challenges to it, and there's a lot of experimentation happening in the digital landscape around peer review and what that might look like and the stages at which it occurs. But I don't think many people really are yet arguing that we shouldn't have it at all. It remains the gold standard, and it's described that way a lot in reviews and reports on peer review processes. There's also an odd persistence of belief in the humanities that open access, indeed any kind of digital innovation, is in some way in conflict with rigorous peer review. That doesn't seem to be the case with the sciences at all, but it's there whenever you start to unpick at peer review and evaluation with people. Open access somehow not being compatible with rigor raises its head. And that leads new initiatives to really set out front and centre what their policies on peer review are. So the Open Library of Humanities in the UK, which is a fantastic initiative, which is at the moment dealing with journals rather than books, has a really thorough a high-profile statement about its peer review policy that I don't think I've seen anything quite like that anywhere else. Indeed, journals where it might be assumed that there's very rigorous peer review, you go and you often can't find very much detail about what's going on. So open access for the moment, there's a need to overstate, in a way, the peer review that's going on around value. I said that nobody is thinking really about getting rid of traditional peer review altogether, or not many people, but there's a lot of experimentation going on with measuring reputation, and we've heard about some of that already. And it's mostly being facilitated by emerging digital technologies, which are allowing us to think about how we measure value and reputation differently, and how we might move to quantify it in ways that really are meaningful for humanities research. And the majority of these experiments around evaluation are still very closely linked to publication and to roles in the publishing process, like being an editor or a reviewer, because publishing is still so fundamental to what we do as humanities researchers. And I think it's very encouraging that some of these initiatives are beginning to recognise levels of social and academic engagement, how often you contribute to be a peer reviewer, for example, and rewarding the good academic citizen that we're all encouraged to be, and that sometimes goes a little bit by the wayside because it's hard to see exactly how that's going to feed into career goals, for example. So you'll be familiar with all of these, I'm sure, but Publons is exactly one of those, which is designed to recognise peer review and allow people to demonstrate what they're contributing to academic culture. I was particularly pleased with this service, actually, because having flagged up at a previous presentation that science is quite often used as shorthand for research in a way that's very off-putting to humanities researchers, they changed this homepage to say speeding up research rather than speeding up science. And I hope that that's something that will feed through more so that we get over some of this reluctance about using new methods of evaluation. We've talked about Altmetric already, and it isn't just that it gives you a score, whatever that may mean. It is, as Amy said, that it allows you to see what people are doing with your research, what's been successful, how are they communicating about it, how might you go on to shape that narrative. And I think it is really important to engage with these new types of measurements, even if you are a bit skeptical about them, because they are going to be used by other people in research assessment processes. So take ownership of that and try to shape what people find about your research and make sure that it's presented in a light that really does reflect the impact that your work is having. And it's fantastic to see an initiative like Bookmetrics, which is expanding that more established process for journals to books and looking at readers and downloads and mentions and citations and this whole mix of measures, so that we're not getting a simplistic narrative that's simply about downloads. It's allowing something more sophisticated to go on and collect a basket of information that can be used to tell a much more nuanced picture of the value and impact of particular kinds of research. There are other interesting processes that are going on. This Programming Historian is a wonderful open access resource, which is actually applying peer review to a different kind of research output, which is a tutorial. And that doesn't just peer review and thereby give status to this this different type of work, which sometimes sits outside measurement processes. But it also, as you can see, recognises the input from reviewers, not in a very obvious way. It's not sort of beating people around the head with it, but it's showing that this is the result of a lot of people's input, and there should be some way of reflecting that, even if it's not with a metric, with a number. And finally, I just wanted to pick up on something again that Amy mentioned, which is what if your research doesn't fit into the normal channels? A recent report looking at interdisciplinary research identified that there's a major perceived and I think real problem for people who work in disciplines that don't quite fit into single discipline publishing arrangements. And it was recognised as being a problem by groups from funders to researchers to universities. So right across the spectrum, there's a perception that we have problems knowing what to do with this research, and particularly with knowing how to measure it. And I think that also feeds into problems of discoverability and how important that is for the value of your work and being able to demonstrate the impact that it's had on people. So that's focusing a little bit on some of the problems, but also I hope picking up on Amy's point about engaging actively with this process and trying to shape your own research story. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Some brilliant examples in that as well, and I'm sure lots of questions will come in at the end. Right, Charles Watkinson is up next. So Charles, I'm just going to make you presenter, and then you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Are you seeing my screen there?
Yeah, all good.
I'm Charles Watkinson, yes, Director of University of Michigan Press, as Kat mentioned. I'm going to talk about Altmetrics more from a publisher end. Full disclosure, we're proud to have Amy as one of our authors, but what I wanted to talk about is how we've used Altmetrics for books at University of Michigan Press. And this is still quite new for us. We've probably only had the Altmetric for books implementation for about 6 months. Although prior to that, we were trialing Altmetric for our journals and for some of our open access books. But we now have Altmetric for books turned on for all our books, both open access and for fee. So University of Michigan Press is primarily a book publisher, and we publish about 110 books a year, and in 2016 about 15% of those were open access. So the reasons that we use Altmetric for books, here are 3 of those. The first reason is that we are wanting to tell a richer story of impact in order to retain and attract authors. And I'm going to share some data about that in a moment. Secondly, we're using the information that we get from Altmetric to help the editors guide their lists, to work out what they might acquire, what's doing well, what's doing badly, how their existing books are doing, what Altmetric suggests for new areas they might acquire books in. And finally, it really helps our marketing department to work out how their strategies for promoting our books are getting, how successful they are, where our books are being picked up, where they're being discussed, where potentially there are other opportunities to promote them, or other sort of hooks, narratives to link them to. So just drilling into the question of how this helps us get and retain our authors, we did a survey in October 2016 to try and find out how our authors felt about promoting their books, how they were approaching that work, and the sorts of information they wanted to receive back to feed into their profiles, to help influence their research, and all those other sort of factors that Amy and Jane talked about. So this was a survey that we did in parallel with a larger Altmetric.com survey. We just focused on our authors, and we had about 200 responses. there are a couple of highlights that I wanted to share from that survey. The first one was striking to us because it suggested that we were probably on the right track in terms of using a tool like Altmetric for books. So would your choice of publisher be influenced by the publisher's ability to provide information beyond sales reports about how your work was received and used? So 51% of the respondents said yes. Many were still thinking about what this meant for them. Only 9% said no. So that suggested that this was a good thing that we were doing to try and get some more information back to our authors. This graph is interesting for a couple of reasons. So which of the following indicators of engagement would you be most interested to see? So you can see that the indicator of engagement that scholars that we work with are still most interested in are academic citations, so over at the far side. You know, from there, you can see syllabi and reading lists, downloads and usage stats, mainstream media coverage, so you know, mentions in the Washington Post, for example, social media, so Twitter, Facebook, etc. Specialist book reviews, so in specialist journals appropriate for the discipline, and then general book reviews that might be in something you know, like the New York Times. It could also be in the Huffington Post or a more general sort of place. Policy documents, Wikipedia mentions, and then public comments are least important. So that's one interesting thing about this graph. But the second interesting thing is how, you know, this behavior, you know, this hierarchy of indicators of engagement, it really doesn't vary by the academic rank of the respondent. So full professors and associate professors have very similar patterns of response to assistant professors, to PhDs, to independent scholars and other types of respondent. So we don't get a strong feeling of a sort of a different response from new scholars to more established scholars. We did look at disciplinary variation as well, and we saw some variation there, but not particularly statistically significant. So Altmetric for books provides some of the information that our scholars want, but not all, and some of the most important things we're still not able to provide them. Bookmetrics was shown on the Springer site, and that is pulling in citation data from Crossref. But the standard Altmetric for books that we've got implemented does not pull in citation information. And in any case, as Amy pointed out, citation indices for books are very problematic. Syllabi and reading lists, this is a fairly recent addition to Altmetric for books and Altmetric in general, using open syllabi data, and this is very interesting and very relevant. Downloads and usage stats, we don't generally use our own platform. We have a platform for open access books that's our own, but otherwise we rely on aggregators like JSTOR or EBSCO or Project Muse or ProQuest. And we're struggling at the moment to get data back from those places into a usable form that we can transmit to our authors. It's often gathered in slightly different ways. It's hard to aggregate, it's hard to map, and it's hard to communicate out. So we're really missing out on providing downloads and usage stats, and Altmetric for books doesn't really help us with that. But then you'll see a lot of yeses going down after that. Specialist book reviews, it's interesting to see Altmetric adding more and more sources for that. So for example, the Bryn Mawr Classical Review was recently added, which is very important for us. And then public comments, I mean, who cares? I mean, the authors don't care, we don't mind. We're getting public reaction in a proxy way through many of the Twitter and Facebook comments. So that was really about thinking about authors and you know, how it helps with our authors. For acquisitions and marketing, so for press staff, the ways that these internal stakeholders are using Altmetrics are they're very interested in getting some early feedback about general reception. So it takes a while in our humanities and social science fields for reviews to come out, maybe a couple of years even. So it's nice to get some early feedback to get a sense of how our books are doing. And we get that through many of the sources Altmetric tracks. So to the open syllabi question, the question of whether our book, a particular book, is being picked up as a text is really crucial to us. And we haven't been able to track that before. And then lastly, as Jane and Amy mentioned, open access books are becoming more and more important for us. And in an increasing number of cases, they're being funded by parent institutions of the author or by an external foundation. And these funders are quite reasonably asking for some sense of the return on investment of the money that they gave. So our ability to tell them something about the impact of the works they fund, and especially in a way that aligns with their strategic priorities, is really important. I just wanted to give some examples of how this works in practice. So this is a book, Just Vibrations, that we published in mid-2016. This is a book that really is quite a cross-genre kind of study. It starts from musicology, but it crosses over into disability studies, into a number of different fields. And we were very curious, as was the author, about the kind of reception that this book would get. So in this case, this is an open access book. It's in a field where the scholars are highly networked electronically. So we're getting some interesting feedback from the Twitter sphere. And what's nice, of course, is that altmetric.com allows you to drill down and actually see the sources from which it's calculating the score and doing other analyses. And here we got a sense of lots of different people liking the book and also seeing opportunities to pick it up in particular fields. Such as the crypt-lib folks would be interested, says one of the tweeters. So that really helps us get a sense of reaction. Here's a slightly older book. This is a book published in 2001, which has been well adopted as a text. When we published it, or when my predecessors published it, they were hoping that it would be of interest to educators and students in the fields of African American studies, childhood studies, gender studies, juvenile studies, social work, and sociology. What we're now able to see through the open syllabus tracking is we're able to see a number of institutions featuring this book on their syllabi. And what's interesting to me is just how strongly it's being used in education courses as well. So when we do a new edition of this book, we'll want to really be sure to market it to education courses. But otherwise, we were fairly right in terms of the dominance of sociology courses in picking it up. And then finally, this is an example of a book funded by a funder with a particular interest. So the Hewlett Foundation funded an open access version of this political science study with a particular interest in creating an informed citizenry about the work of Congress and candidates for its offices. So, a proxy measure for that is just how much discussion in the mainstream media and also in sort of specialist political blogs, for example, we might be getting from this book. And indeed, through the Altmetric attention tracking, we can see that it's being picked up by the Washington Post, but also by Vox and Salon, major forums for engaged political junkies to sort of get their information. Finally, I just wanted to say a little bit about what's next for our use of Altmetric. One of the important things to remember is that it's still a struggle for Altmetric to pick up mentions which are not formatted in a pretty structured way. So, if an author shares the URL associated with the book, or the DOI, or the ISBN, that mention, if it's picked up by the review source or wherever, that will usually get tracked. That will get tracked. But often, for example, in review journals, especially in mainstream review coverage, there actually may not be mention of the ISBN, and that's a little bit more tricky. So we really need to encourage our authors when they're being mentioned by newspapers or whatever, to make sure that they share a link with that media source in a way that we will be able to pick up the mention when it gets made. So there's author education is quite important. Working out how best to communicate Altmetric information to our authors in the forums where we usually feed information to them. So at the moment, we've got a good system for feeding royalty, sales information, licensing information with authors, but we need to improve our ability to include other sorts of information in that same channel. So, not only Altmetrics, but as we get them, usage and download stats. So that's a matter of just how we communicate with our authors and making sure it's a richer communication. And finally, just being very systematic about using the Altmetric information to shape our editorial and marketing decisions. And currently, we are working with Altmetric Explorer for publishers, which is iterating to be even better for books. And we're still learning how to really use that tool, which gives us this behind-the-scenes look across our books to really help the editors make good decisions. So that's where I'm coming from as a publisher.
Lovely, thank you, Charles. Really interesting stuff there as well. We have a few minutes now to cover some questions that have come in, so I'll just be reading them out and direct them. So Amy, one for you here. You mentioned that you were able to track many more citations than either Web of Science or Google Scholar. Where were you looking that they aren't?
Hi, I just had to unmute myself. So it's interesting because some of this involves traditional research skills, and that has made all the difference. Citation chaining, searching through even MLA, some of the traditional search indexes through the library, and sort of cobbling them together has been incredibly helpful. The syllabus question that Charles brought up, I think, is also really important in terms of citations. It's very important to our faculty. We've actually added a line in our annual evaluations that asks faculty to include their use of their materials on various syllabi. So in my department, if I can say my book was used at an NEH seminar or a rare book seminar, that has that goes a long way to showing impact. So some of that you just have to kind of find through traditional Google searching, but again, this goes to the point of field-specific questions. So in digital humanities, we tend to make open syllabi. I'm thinking also of projects like the Columbia Open Syllabi project, where they're scraping syllabi from across the United States. All of these questions, all of these searches depend on people making their syllabi open access. So a lot of this does come back to these crucial issues.
Great, thanks for that extra insight, Amy. Someone has asked, what does a good Altmetric score for a book look like? So this is the Altmetric attention score is a weighted count of the number of mentions that a book or a chapter have seen, and it's intended to reflect kind of the volume of the reach and the likely influence of those mentions. I don't actually have the information on what the average Altmetric score for a book would be, but I think that's a really good question. I would say typically we tend to see fewer mentions for a book than for a journal article, and that's partly to do with the way that people talk about books. So they'll just share, for example, the chapter title or perhaps the author, and it makes it much harder for us to pick up that attention. So a bit like Charles was outlining the different ways that we can track it, what we're really keen to do is to encourage authors or people who are consuming this content to share it in a way that makes it easier for us to analyse how it is being used and where it's being disseminated. Charles, a question for you here. if you were talking to a book editor or an author who perhaps wanted to make their book more visible or to make other audiences more aware of it, what advice would you have for them about how they might distribute their book further?
Yes, we tend to share some simple tips with our authors now about how to promote their book electronically. I know that there are some publishers who are sharing really very elaborate and comprehensive guides. For example, Elsevier does this in the sciences. But we've taken the approach of just, a few simple things that you might do. And for authors about altmetric.com and just how it works. But we're asking them to really try and make sure that a structured link, the URL, the DOI, the ISBN, some kind of identifier is shared whenever they're tweeting, etc. So that's our first tip to them. Secondly, there's the simple thing of perhaps including a mention of your book at the bottom of your email signature line. And thirdly, we're getting a lot more of a sort of requests around things like academia.edu and some of the academic social networking sites. We're not wild about those, but that's a reality of many disciplines. And so we are making table of contents and an excerpt from the introduction, for example, available to our authors so that they can post on those sites, with the request that they do again include a solid link to the original version, or a permanent identifier as well. So those are a few things that we're encouraging our authors to do, and we're really emphasizing the partnership aspect around marketing, because clearly authors being able to promote to their networks is very important, increasingly important in the internet age.
Lovely. Just time for a couple more questions, I think. So, Jane, you mentioned about encouraging humanities researchers in particular to kind of get on board and to explore new tools to help them demonstrate the impacts of their work. What kind of practical advice do you have? Like, how do you go about it with researchers in your institution? Do you think it's effective?
It's difficult, I think, is the short answer to it. The longer answer is, I think it's important to lead with the benefits for individual researchers of doing this, because I have a number of colleagues who the very idea of some kind of number, as you mentioned, so what does this number mean? It's not a percentage of anything, so what's it saying? That really frightens people, and that suspicion about quantifying things that Amy mentioned is really quite embedded in some people. So it's really leading with the benefits and what this can mean for you in terms of reaching new and different audiences, and the value that that can bring to you by hearing new opinions, making new connections, linking up with people who you might not have done otherwise. So I think it's something that has to be kind of plugged away at, rather than the scales falling from people's eyes when they come in to a 1 hour discussion. It's a longer process of just working through the benefits for people, and also I think realizing that it's not going to be something that everybody is going to want to spend a huge amount of time on, and actually that's okay if they don't really want to do it. Trying to force people to do it just ends up meaning that they're going to engage with it badly and be resentful about it. So I think it's something that people have to come to themselves through understanding the value of it.
Yeah, I think great answer there. And I think Amy might have mentioned in her presentation, not all metrics are going to matter to everyone. Some audiences, and being able to evidence, engagement from those audiences is going to be more important to some people than others. So it's really about picking out the metrics that evidence what you want to demonstrate about your work, and making sure that they represent it fairly. Just a couple more. Sorry, go on, Jane.
I was just going to agree, and that's going to vary depending on your type of research as well, that your impact might be reaching 2 or 3 really key policymakers rather than having a wide public audience, and the way you do that will differ and affect the metrics that are valuable.
Charles, one more question that's come in that you might be able to help us out with. It's a really good one. How would you advise university communication staff to coordinate marketing efforts with the publisher's marketing efforts to promote a new book?
Yeah, that's a great one. One thing that we're really looking into here is getting the institution to also subscribe to another Altmetric product. I feel like a bit of an Altmetric.com salesperson, but Altmetric Explorer for institutions really is something that allows the institution as a whole to track output recognition indicators around their own faculty. And so it's clearly something that's very interesting to the communications department, to the Office of Research, to places like that. Talking with the communications office about Altmetric for institutions has really opened a door for us into talking about our work and the sorts of indicators that we're getting around this sort of aspect of university encouragement of academic dialogue. So, actually having the conversation around Altmetric.com has been a way to help partner. But it's a constant challenge. I mean, clearly, university communications departments are dealing with a lot. One thing that we struggle with all the time is we tend to get put into a category called arts and culture, which is about sort of publicizing museum exhibits and things like that. And really, university press is not exactly about that. It's much more akin to the Office of Research's interests. And so helping position ourselves on campus as being a core part of the research enterprise, not some sort of siloed area just about cultural, artistic enterprise. Nothing wrong with that. That's been a constant struggle. But I think Altmetric opens the door to more conversation.
Lovely, thank you. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. Just quickly before we wrap up, I wanted to alert you all to a couple of other things that are going on this week. So we've obviously run this webinar as part of the Academic Book Week that's taking place at the moment. There are a lot of great events going on. There's another one here at the Macmillan campus in London tomorrow, so if you're in town, do come along. But they're all listed on the Academic Book Week website, and a lot of them involve remote activities, so you can just participate online if you're not able to get somewhere in person. For our part at Altmetric, we'll be posting a couple of other blog posts and other initiatives through the week. We'll be featuring a Pinterest board that showcases some of the books that we've seen the most attention for. And we'll be encouraging you to share your book. So send us a picture of you and your book or a link to your favourite academic book. And we'll check to see if we're tracking it and share the details pages with you if we found attention for it already. So that's it for today. Thank you to our brilliant speakers and to everyone who submitted questions. I hope you've all enjoyed the session, and we'll be posting a write-up on the blog later this week.